TheSynchroMystic presents. According to press reports, the majority of Americans believe that 35th U.S. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was murdered as a part of some sort of conspiracy. However, there's always that one holdout, a colleague, friend, or other acquaintance who insists that accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. In this video, in commemoration of the 59th anniversary of JFK's untimely death, I'll sketch 10 reasons to believe that there is more to the tale than one communist-sympathizing lone nut. The aim here is certainly not to break new ground or to favor one particular hypothesis over another. Rather, the points to be surveyed are merely intended as candidate opening moves, as it were. They may be used in circumstances, such as over holiday dinners, where partisans of the official story ask for justification for the skeptic's position. Number 10. Legend has it that there is a presumption of innocence in the legal system of the United States of America. At a minimum, this is supposed to mean that a person is considered to be innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. According to the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, this is to play out via a speedy public trial in front of an impartial jury in the relevant jurisdiction. The accused is to have the opportunity to address the evidence and testimony against him with the help of a competent lawyer. Of course, as now deceased attorney Mark Lane vociferously pointed out, Lee Harvey Oswald received no such trial, was never afforded a robust legal defense, and since he was essentially summarily executed while under the, quote, protection of the Dallas Police Department, never had the opportunity to confront or answer any of his accusers. While these facts by themselves may not suffice to show that JFK was assassinated as part of a conspiracy, they persuade me that Oswald's guilt was never established according to this country's historical canons of judicial fairness. Number 9. What about the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy? Better known as the Warren Commission, this was the body empowered to investigate the assassination. As JFK's immediate successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, would, in an impartial and sane world, surely have rated more than a passing glance as an accomplice or suspect himself. Indeed, he would later be implicated by career CIA man E. Howard Hunt in what has become known as Hunt's deathbed confession. Even setting aside the fact that Kennedy's death catapulted Johnson into the highest office in the land, the new president's commission initially resisted any attempt to allow Oswald posthumously to receive a fair hearing. That including an actual defense for the recently deceased defendant was at best an afterthought must surely cast doubt on the pretense that the Warren Commission approximated anything like a fair trial. Furthermore, the commission was populated by at least one of JFK's presumed enemies, namely Allen Dulles. Recall that Kennedy had fired Dulles from the uber-secretive Central Intelligence Agency. When one reflects on this fact, one can easily sympathize with then-influential columnist and television personality Dorothy Kilgallen, who publicly ridiculed the Warren Commission's report as laughable. Dorothy decided to bring her considerable investigative talents to bear on the matter. Unfortunately, on November the 8th, 1965, she turned up dead in highly suspicious circumstances before her potentially history-altering conclusions could see the light of day. Or again, consider JFK's brother, Robert Bobby Kennedy. According to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK believed that the supposedly exhaustive report was, quote, a shoddy piece of craftsmanship. Of course, RFK himself was shot dead in June of 1968, when he was potentially close to being nominated as the Democratic candidate for the office of the presidency. The story goes that Bobby's assassination led the U.S. Secret Service to offer to safeguard high-level political candidates. A lot of good that does, seeing that JFK ostensibly enjoyed the same, quote, protections when he became the fourth president to be murdered in office, by official count anyway, and the first to be assassinated since the Secret Service began shielding the commander-in-chief. Number 8. And if it weren't bad enough to have prominent members of the public rejecting the Warren Commission's authoritative-sounding pronouncements, the word is some of its own members may not have believed it either. For instance, according to various documents belonging to the late Richard B. Russell, a former Democratic senator from Georgia, Russell was troubled by the Warren Commission's conclusion that a single bullet killed President John F. Kennedy and wounded former Texas Governor John Connally, even though he signed the commission's report. Supposedly, however, Russell had been one of 3 commission members who at first refused to lend their names to the final report. The others were Senator John Cooper and Congressman Hale Boggs. Although Hale Boggs would waffle and make contradictory claims before his own mysterious disappearance and presumed death in an airplane crash in late 1972, At one time, he disclosed his, quote, strong doubts about the magic bullet theory. Number 7. When nearly half of commission members had grave misgivings about signing their own, quote, findings, it isn't surprising that upwards of half of the American public can't bring themselves to believe it either. Prominent people who have in one capacity or other expressed some measure of disbelief include numerous celebrities, from Kevin Costner and Tommy Lee Jones to Oliver Stone and Bruce Willis. In the political sphere, the quirky, left-leaning, independent former professional wrestler and ex-governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, is a professed doubter of the system-approved account, as are occasional presidential hopefuls John Forbes Kerry and Gary Warren Hartpence. The latter, better known as Gary Hart, went so far as to point out the obvious failure of mainstream American journalism to do any real follow-up on the myriad indicators of widespread treachery. In fact, this dereliction of press responsibility is so grievous and on its face so inexplicable that it deserves its own treatment, which I hope to provide. For now, suffice it to say that at least since World War II, the relationship between the media and the intelligence services has been a little, well, murky. Number 6. Let's try to make this point more vividly. Case in point, consider a then-youthful CBS News correspondent Dan Rather speaking about his viewing of the film of the assassination captured by Ukrainian-born American clothier Abraham Zapruder. Rather misrepresents the result of the second shot that hit Kennedy, which he calls the third total shot, falsely claiming that it caused the president's head to move violently forward.
A second shot, the third total shot, hit the president's head. His head could be seen to move violently forward.
In fact, Kennedy's head was savagely blown back and to the left, in the memorable phraseology of director Oliver Stone's film, JFK. You'll note that in 1963, the Zapruder film was purchased by Time Life and essentially put on ice. It's an interesting story, and it involves a now seldom mentioned former OSS operative, Army psychological warfare mastermind, and Eisenhower speechwriter named Charles Douglas C.D. Jackson. The full telling will have to wait, but for the time being, I'll simply note that except for the publication of odd still frames, several of which were reproduced out of their proper sequence, Dan Rather's claims could not readily be exposed as fabrications. In 2022, when Zapruder's footage is easily discovered by anyone with a web browser, widely available references such as Wikipedia now casually admit that there were, quote, inaccuracies in Dan Rather's description of the film. That's an understatement. Number 5. Rather was far from unique, and the relentless Oswald alone agitprop continues to be pushed by soulless apparatchiks like Peter Jennings well into the 21st century. But occasional interesting tidbits can be found. For example, consider comments made by Lyndon Johnson to Walter Cronkite in 1969. LBJ stated that he couldn't rule out the assassination involving, quote, international connections.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
For some reason, Cronkite, billed as the most trusted man in America, was inexplicably standing by a newswire machine at around noon, Dallas time, when the JFK assassination dispatch came through. Quite remarkable foresight. Number 4. As we hope to excavate in a future video, even a partial accounting of the worrying interrelationships between major newspapers and television networks on the one hand and the Central Intelligence Agency on the other shows that among the worst offenders were some of the biggest names in the business. For example, CBS and the New York Times. So perhaps it isn't all that surprising that this particular comment owes to a man who was a fixture of public broadcasting instead. In an interview with Diane Rame, Jim Lara remarked, "I went at my reporting on the idea that there had to be a conspiracy. The only issue was, what kind of conspiracy? I would say that Lara's quote is extraordinary, but on the contrary, it seems to me that nothing could be more ordinary. Perhaps we should take it as an attestation of the adage, apparently falsely attributed to George Orwell, that in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." Number 3. Former President Richard M. Nixon isn't exactly remembered for his honesty. The only president ever forced to resign his office. He, or someone in his administration, ran an espionage and sabotage campaign against his political enemies. This culminated in the Watergate debacle, in which a group of burglars, including several Central Intelligence agents, such as E. Howard Hunt, were arrested trying to bug the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Coincidentally, quote-unquote, Hunt was also likely front and center in the JFK assassination, at least according to his own alleged deathbed confession, as told to his son, St. John Hunt. Even some possible and famous photographic evidence of this exists. It has long been suspected that E. Howard Hunt was one of the 3 so-called hobos or tramps present at Ground Zero on November the 22nd, 1963. In his secret audio tapes, Nixon made repeated references to his fear that the Watergate investigations would uncover the, quote, whole Bay of Pigs thing. To hear Nixon's former White House Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, tell it, this was merely a code phrase for Kennedy's assassination. At one point, Nixon appeals for cover-up help to then Director of Central Intelligence, Richard Helms. In his usual halted, rambling style, Nixon is heard to bring up, quote, the who shot John angle, asking, is Eisenhower to blame? Is Kennedy to blame? Is Johnson to blame? Is Nixon to blame? Etc., etc. It may become, not by me, a very vigorous issue, but if it does, I need to know what is necessary to protect, frankly, the intelligence gathering and the dirty tricks department, and I will protect it. I've done more than my fair share of lying to protect you, and I believe it's totally right to do it. So here is the sitting U.S. president, Tricky Dick himself, asking the head of the CIA for information on who shot John Kennedy. And of course, quite interestingly, Helms did not say, well, of course it was Lee Harvey Oswald. Number 2. Which brings up another curiosity. After 59 years, some of the JFK-associated records are still off limits. This naturally brings a few questions to mind, such as, what are they still hiding? At this point, establishment pundits typically scoff, as if the only reason to fret about secret archival information is the chimerical quest for a smoking gun document. But such thoughts are wrong-headed in 2 equal and opposite directions. For one thing, the fact that some records remain hidden, even at this historical distance, displays the bad faith of certain government archivists. It's already beyond question that there has been a cover-up. That the same players still resist or outright refuse oversight is frankly insulting. But this leads to a second and perhaps more important point, one which moves in a diametrically different direction. Namely, it is reasonable to think that the sealed files are an emblem of a pathological lack of volition on the part of the American people. We don't need to wait for some smoking gun. The evidence already available is more than sufficient to show that President John F. Kennedy was murdered by conspirators, some of whom, or some of whose heirs, are yet in power. The problem isn't sealed files. The problem is collective paralysis. Number 1. As a final attestation to the fact that overwhelming evidence for conspiracy is widely available, we need look no further than the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Established in 1976, it looked into the JFK murder, among other things. Its conclusions? One was this. The committee believes, on the basis of the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. A second conclusion was that there is a, quote, high probability of a second gunman, meaning, whatever conspiracy you favor, Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone.